On today's show, have the Sacramento Kings regressed from last season, or has the rest of the league just gotten that much better? What are the Kings' chances of escaping the play-in tournament bracket in the Western Conference, and how head coach Mike Brown is trading some of the Kings' offensive potency for improved defense? It's all coming up on today's Locked On NBA.
You are Locked On NBA, your daily NBA podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, and welcome to another edition of Locked On NBA, the biggest stories with the local experts. I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, also host of Locked On Rockets, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is America's #1 fantasy sports app with over 3 million members. They're the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports because it's just you against the numbers. You just pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. PrizePicks is so simple to play. You can make your picks and submit an entry in less than 60 seconds. They've got quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of different players and stat types, which is what makes PrizePicks the #1 DFS app on the market. And now it's demon time on PrizePicks. Demons and goblins are the newest and most exciting way to play over at PrizePicks. Squares marked with red demons or green goblins get you different payouts. You can now win up to 100 times back your money with as little as 4 correct picks. So if you've been thinking about giving daily fantasy sports a try, go check out PrizePicks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, that's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA with promo code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. PrizePicks, pick more, pick less. It's that easy. Joining us now is the host of Locked On Kings, Matt George. You can track down wherever you listen to your podcast and on YouTube. Just search Locked On Kings. And Matt, right now, the Sacramento Kings kind of fighting to maybe escape the play-in tournament bracket in the Western Conference. So I want to start right there. After last season's success, right, finishing as the 3 seed in a very, very good, stacked Western Conference, how should this season be viewed, at least up to this point, as the Kings are currently sitting in 7th? They're a half game back of the Suns in that 6th seed and trying to, fight out of the play-in tournament area of the standings.
Yeah, I think it's all a matter of perspective, and this is what a lot of Sacramento Kings fans, I think, have been processing over the course of this season. The reality is, from a Kings fan perspective, it's been a long time since Sacramento has come into a season with high expectations and with the expectation to not just return to the playoffs, but to build upon a playoff year. So, a lot of people probably aren't surprised by where the Sacramento Kings are, specifically in the sense that they ran the same group back, right? They basically took last year's team and brought them back in, made some minor adjustments and minor additions like a Sasha Vezenkov and a Chris Duarte and pieces like that. But for the most part, this core is basically the same. And then the same thing at this trade deadline, they decided not to really do anything and stick with this group. Lo and behold, the Kings are right on pace to match that 48 win total from last season. The only difference between last season and this season is the Western Conference decided to turn into a big ugly beast. So 48 wins might be a 6th seed at best this season versus a 3rd seed last year. So to me, what I think this season ultimately is turning out to be, now the Kings could still make it further and could be a more successful season if the Kings make it out of the first round of the playoffs. Even if they get into the playoffs through the play-in, but make it out of the first round and make it to the second round, arguably this season's more successful than the 3rd seed last year. But I think what this season is ultimately about is, there's no kind of polite way to put this, is kind of separating the boys from the men. It's essentially, okay, which of this group do we actually believe can help us win a championship? And which of this group is good, but not good enough? And I think that's become more and more clear as we've gotten to this part of the season. The untouchables are there, the Foxes, the Sabonises. I think Keegan Murray is up there, although he's not necessarily untradeable. Malik Monk might be gone this summer in free agency, but Malik is definitely a core piece of it. And then there's guys like Kevin Huerter, maybe Harrison Barnes to some extent, guys that you're okay if you have them on your team. They're not bad players, but ultimately they're probably not what you need to accomplish your main goal, which is eventually winning an NBA championship.
Yeah, and at that point you'll have, kind of 2 years worth of data points and information to basically be like, make a better, more informed decision about, okay, can we really, run this group back a 3rd year and expect different results, right? The definition of insanity, just doing the same thing over and over and hoping for a different result. Now, when we look at all the jockeying taking place in the standings right now, this kind of, 6-7 thing going on between the Suns and the Kings is going to come down to the wire, it feels like, with there's still one more meetup between these two teams. Weirdly, one more meetup, a fifth game between these two teams to decide the season series, currently tied up at 2 games apiece. How crucial is that game going to be for Sacramento to ideally completely avoid the play-in?
Well, Jackson, I want to help you out here too, because you don't want to piss off Nick Angstead and the Dallas Mavericks fans out too, because they're just very much in the mix as well. The Kings next week have 2 massive games, Tuesday night and Friday night, against the Dallas Mavericks, who the Kings as of right now are tied with in the standings. Both teams, the first time they meet, will be playing on the second night of a back-to-back. The only problem is the Kings will be playing the 76ers, while the Mavericks will be playing the Utah Jazz. So there's probably a higher expectation of the Mavericks winning their game than the Sacramento Kings winning theirs. So the Mavericks are very much in the mix as well. So the Kings got to get through those 2 games first. And they have to, if they win both those games, hopefully it wouldn't put the Mavericks away by any means, but create enough separation for them to then solely focus on the Phoenix Suns. The reality is, in all the meetings that the Kings have had against the Suns, they've been the better team. Sacramento has looked better than Phoenix every single time they've played, but that hasn't mattered because they completely collapsed, blowing an over 20-point lead in the fourth quarter in one of their Suns losses. And the other game was kind of back and forth, and ultimately Phoenix got out of there with the victory. So these two teams are very evenly matched. Of course, the star power favors Phoenix, but star power doesn't necessarily always win you a game. And the Kings, like I said, have looked better when those two teams have faced. Regardless, like, it won't shock me at all if we're looking at game 81 or game 82 is when this race is decided, which I guess is exactly what the NBA wants, but maybe not what you want if you're the Kings, Suns, or Mavericks trying to get yourself as right as possible for a playoff run. Shout out to
our fearless leader, Nick Angstead. My apologies for looking at the standings through some purple tinted shades there for a moment, just looking at the 6-7 matchup. But
I didn't say I didn't hate it. I love it. I love it. Actually, right, count the Mavericks out. I'm in.
There we go. All right. Just earning some points with some Kings fans while I'm here. Now, I know you touched on this a moment ago, just the competition in the Western Conference and how much more of a bloodbath it's been kind of this season. But I'm curious, just when you look at the numbers, actually, right, last year, the Kings were the best offense in the NBA. This year, they're clocking in at 12th in the NBA. So I'm curious, is it just, do you feel like it's just the rest of the NBA has gotten that much better, or do you feel like the Kings have actually kind of regressed offensively compared to how good they were last season?
It's a little of both. I mean, offenses have definitely gotten better this year. Statistically, there's no doubts about it. Like, the Kings had the best offensive rating and highest points per game in NBA history last season. And I think there are 2 or 3 teams right now that are ahead of that. And like, they've been that way from start to finish. So offense is at a premium. It continues to be at a premium. And in a lot of ways, statistically, Sacramento is, again, on par, very similar to how they were last season. It's just this year is not the same as last year, right? So it's a mixture of that. But also, I do think the Kings have gotten a little bit worse offensively in the name of getting better defensively. Now, in the grand scheme of this season, the Kings are at best an average defense, mostly slightly below average. But for the month of March, the Kings are a top 3 defense in the NBA right now in this month. They've figured something out, and a lot of it has to do with 3 guard lineups that Mike Brown has figured out, and also the implementation of Keon Ellis, a 2-way player who probably a lot of people listening to this podcast have never heard of or didn't know before maybe a week or 2 ago. He was undrafted out of the University of Alabama, joined the Sacramento Kings, was on a 2-way contract in Stockton last season, started this season on a 2-way contract. He is 8-1 as a starter, and every single game that he has started has been in place of either injured De'Aaron Fox, injured Kevin Huerter, or at one point injured Keegan Murray. And the Kings have enjoyed a lot of success with him. He's getting more playing time. He's picked up the defensive intensity. So the offense, I won't say has taken a back seat, because it's still very much a focus here in Sacramento. It's still very much the strength of this team. But unlike last season, there have been less situations and less games where the Kings have just ridden their offense to victories. They're, especially this stretch right now, like in March, they're winning basketball games still. They're in a lot of competitive games. They just beat the Orlando Magic the other night, but they're not scoring 120 points to do it like they normally would have to. They're scoring in the 110s range, and they're holding, like, this is a crazy stat, Jackson, and I won't ramble too much on this, but I think this is nuts. Like, in the first 63 games of the season, the Kings held their opponent under 110 points in regulation 13 times. They've done that in the last 7 straight games. So, I mean, that's the defense has figured something out, right? But as the defense has become a more of a focus, the offense is not where it was, which kind of makes sense considering going back to the playoffs last year, the Kings defense was really good in the playoffs against the Warriors. Offensively, they didn't look at all like themselves from the regular season. So maybe that's how they know they have to win games in the playoffs.
You mentioned earlier on, right, this group and running it back and trying to kind of build on the success that they did have last season, right, building on last year's playoff appearance. What lesson or lessons do you think that Mike Brown and this team can kind of take into this year's postseason that they learned about them, about the team, about themselves from last year's playoffs?
Well, again, I think it's a lot of like, who your dogs are, who your guys are, and you'll get a little more context from that. I think what the Kings are still trying to figure out is how they can play with the physicality and intensity on the defensive end that they showed they were capable of in the playoffs last year without it completely plummeting their offense, right? The Kings were not nearly as bad of a three-point shooting team as they showed in the playoffs last season. On top of that, like the Kings need to get more of a balance out of everybody, right? Last season, it was the De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis show, although we know Domantas Sabonis struggled a little bit. Malik Monk had some really big games, but wasn't great all 7 games. Keegan Murray took 3 games before he started getting going. Harrison Barnes and Kevin Huerter were MIA basically the entire series. So I think one of the things the Kings can learn is, hey, replicate the way we played on defense and the energy that we played with, but find a way to get a more consistent offense and more output from everybody, not just our top guys. Because again, their goal is to make it past the first round and beyond. From Sacramento's perspective, you make it past the first round, that might be worth a parade in some situations. But ultimately, it's just growing and building upon what you showed you were capable of last year.
Can the Kings carry their newfound defense into the postseason? Where will they ultimately land in the Western Conference standings? You're going to have us covered for all of that and so much more over at Locked On Kings. Matt, thanks for stopping by Locked On NBA with me.
Always a pleasure, Jackson.